Welcome to For Impact, the charity podcast. We're here to give voice to the sector and talk about the taboos and challenges holding it back and what we can do about it. Our topic today is public service or private privilege? What is really behind the resistance to paying trustees? I'm Felicia Willow, founder of Interims for Impact and a charity specialist consultant. I work directly with charities on strategy, governance and crisis, and also work across the sector to address the systemic issues that hold For Impact organisations back. I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Pitt from the Benefact Group.
Hi, Felicia, and hello, everyone.
So, trusteeship is treated as the moral foundation of the charity sector, with voluntary service upheld at its core. But that assumption quietly shapes who can take part in governing charities and who can't. So, this episode asks what really sits behind the resistance to paying trustees. Is payment about professionalism, access, and lived experience, or does it undermine the idea of public service and public trust?
Yeah, I think the headline we're tackling here is paying trustees, but I think it's important to unpack this a bit and recognise that we're not talking about professionalising charities. This is more fundamentally about democratising access to trustee positions and charity leadership. The real question here, I think, is who is getting excluded from being a trustee because of the lack of pay, and how is lack of pay affecting the effectiveness of the charity sector, maybe.
Yeah, indeed. And listeners might ask why we haven't presented both sides of the debate. And I'm going to come out and say it bluntly at the outset, as is my way. This isn't a neutral episode. And that is because those who oppose this idea tend to already be the loudest and most powerful in our sector. And frankly, the conversation keeps getting shut down by these voices. And I didn't feel we needed to platform that. But I should also say that I'm not personally in favour of all trustees being paid, nor do I think that offering limited numbers of trustees payment will solve everything. But it does feel like it's a tool that could help in some areas, and I think it matters that the conversation's being constrained.
Yeah, once again, I think I've learned an awful lot about a topic this time. And I think the view that trustees must be unpaid to remain pure, it feels a bit romantic to me. And it's a fact that it has created a bias towards the privileged, those who can afford to be a trustee, rather than those people we really want as trustees that provide the right balance of really diverse views, the right skills and the right experience.
Well, I've been working on this episode for more than a year, actually, and I think it's telling that it has been really hard to get people to speak openly on this. People don't want to be quoted or named, and that tells its own story. And the most unexpected thing I learned in doing this episode is that actually quite a lot of trustees are paid. And there is a process for applying to pay your trustee via the Charity Commission. So a few years back, I think it was 2017, a study suggested that 1.6% of charities, which is approximately 2,000 of them, pay at least some of their trustees. So I've spent quite a lot of time digging, and I found a real mix. I found some charities that have repeatedly applied to pay very low rates to trustees to increase diversity and access. They've been rejected over and over. I found one larger charity who had asked to pay high rates to balance their gender diversity had been approved. We're talking about tens of thousands of pounds a year there. And I found a few organisations, including Akivo, where their CEO was a paid and voting member of the board. And that's something I'd really like to see more of. It does seem weird in our sector that we don't have CEOs with a vote on the board. But when I tried to get more consistent feedback from the Charity Commission about this, because of course their CEO does go out saying a lot that this is the backbone of the sector, having voluntary trustees, I was told it wasn't possible to get that clarity. And it just feels like this is incredibly inconsistent. And we should be clear on why some approvals go through and others don't. And it doesn't feel like there's a system here. So we know the sector needs great trustees. We need diverse thinking and challenge. We need trustees who are bought in and committed. And I think being able to offer pay in some circumstances is a valid way to do that.
Yeah, and I think this is where I bring a very different perspective again. And for me, a trustee board is potentially no different to a corporate board. You know, it is a vital function of the organisation. It holds big responsibility to guide and challenge. But somehow, charity trustee boards are a bit of a second-class citizen here. But, you know, if the responsibility is equivalent to corporate governance, why isn't the support and accountability equivalent too? And corporate boards are under real scrutiny to be diverse, to represent a voice of their customers, to have specific board members responsible for aspects including diversity and climate. And I've heard of service user panels and young trustee committees in the charity world, and they feel like really good structures if they have a voice which is listened to. However, they still don't hold any real power, and that resides with trustees.
Yeah, and the same thing's clearly happening with some boards that are trying to bring on paid trustees but aren't getting anywhere with the commission. They want to give people a paid seat at the table, but at times this has to come without that legal power, which enters us nicely into our guests, as our first guest is in exactly this situation. So, first up, we're going to speak with Simon Wadiwala, an associate trustee whose payment has enabled her to have a seat at the table, if not a legal vote yet. We hear a statement from an anonymous founder who laments the expectation that her service should be free while those without her lived experience are paid. We chat with Olivia Barker White, whose apparently shocking suggestion of paying trustees prompted the only complaint at the last Festival of Trusteeship. And we also discuss some latest research prompted by the conversations leading up to this very podcast, which casts a different light over the whole debate and destroys more than a few straw man arguments, with Tim Harrison Byrne from NFP Research.
My name is Simon Wadiwala. I've been working as an associate trustee with Friends Provident Foundation for a bit over 2 years now.
Fab. So tell me about that role and how you came to be a paid trustee.
So I was doing some freelance work with Friends Provident for a couple of years before I saw their trustee application. At the time, it was more work for a voluntary role, but it was more interesting to me. I really wanted to go for it. I chatted to members of the team, and when I didn't get invited to an interview, it would have been for the voluntary role. But I ended up asking them at the end of the interview whether they would consider it being paid. And that was because I would be losing out on income. I was really lucky that they said they'd consider it. And a few months later, they came back to me with a proposal of this associate trustee role.
What is an associate trustee? What does that mean at your organisation?
So, another way of framing it is as a trainee trustee. We've sort of been making it up as we go along, but the idea is that I get a fixed payment each month and I have a bigger training budget to be able to attend events, conferences, trainings, that sort of thing. I'm treated like a trustee in most instances. So I go to board meetings, I'm a member of a committee. Whenever they're looking for feedback from the trustee team, I'm included. The things where I'm not like a regular trustee is I'm not legally responsible for the organisation. There's usually, when the trustees are listed, there's a list of trustees, and underneath there's associate trustee, SIM. So there's a bit of a distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic that they've made the effort to do that to enable you to be involved. And it is a shame, obviously, that it has to come without the vote. But why was it necessary for you to be paid in order to do this role?
So I live in Brighton in the southeast, and it's a fairly expensive place to live. The other roles that I have tend to be structured. I do freelance work or self-employed in a few different roles. One of my jobs is being a cleaner and a personal assistant for disabled people. This is the sort of work that I can't really fit around other jobs. If I'm doing a shift, that's most of the day gone. I also have to fit my role around caring responsibilities that I have at home. At the time of applying, it had been 3 or 4 years since I had graduated university, and I had been working in a variety of different roles, but none of them were permanent full time. The £300 that Friends Provident pay me each month was the most stable income that I could rely on. It made a difference to being able to say no to other work where that was low paid or that took up most of the day. It just meant that I would be able to go to a meeting in the middle of the day.
Yeah, because otherwise you wouldn't be getting paid for what you were doing. That's kind of like you'd be losing money if you had a meeting in the middle of the day. Otherwise, that's the kind of idea, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
The Charity Commission has an interesting position on paying trustees. I mean, if you actually go to them, technically any charity can ask. It seems like there is a team that covers this. Apparently, in the working on this podcast, I've discovered that something like 1.6 or 1.7% of trustees are paid, and this is paid, voting trustees, which is quite a surprise to me. You can get approval for it, and it seems quite unpredictable as to who gets the approval and who doesn't. I know obviously the current CEO of the Charity Commission has said very openly and very strongly that he's against trustees being paid. But with your experience and how you've come into being a trustee, what's your perspective on this perceived, I guess, prohibition on paying trustees?
I mean, without being offered to be paid, I wouldn't have been able to take up this role. And there are so many instances where the kinds of conversations that I've had, the things that I've been able to learn about, just would not have been accessible to me otherwise. If you pay trustees, then you're allowing more people into higher level decision making in significant groups of people, as it should be. If charities aren't willing to pay their trustees, there should be a really good reason why, and not just that be the default, because it is exclusionary.
It is. And I imagine that the value that you also bring to the charity itself as well. I mean, I can't imagine there's many people with your perspectives and your life experience that are sitting on that board alongside you.
It's true that most trustees tend to have salaried positions, professionals, having been in the sector for quite a long time. Yeah, I definitely don't take things for granted in the same way that other trustees do.
That feels like a really important perspective to have on board, not taking things for granted and, knowing.
I certainly have a lot of questions.
Yeah, that is also really important as a trustee. Yeah. So if someone's listening to this podcast and they want to do what you've done, what would you advise them to do?
The kind of learning journey that any trustee board can take is going to vary depending on the charity, depending on the sector. There are some really helpful trainings that I've been to that have opened me up to, for example, learning about investing that I just didn't know about. But as Friends Problem Foundation is a foundation and has an endowment, part of the activities alongside making grants is also doing investments. And so that became a really important thing that I then had to learn about. I'd say my perspective for coming into the foundation was that I worked with organisations similar to the ones that were receiving grants. I had this economic justice perspective on a grassroots level, but that is the mission of the foundation. But that's going to be different for whatever charity it is.
Are you the only one still currently?
I am the only one. It was originally designed to be a year from June 23 to 24, but we put in a charity commission application with the intention of allowing for 2 paid trustees on the board, of which I would be one of them. The application's been declined twice and we're reapplying now, and that's why my term keeps getting extended. But the idea would be that when we get an answer from the charity commission, I think folks are rooting for me to become a full trustee. But in either case, there would be a new associate trustee. And this is like a model now that they want to incorporate going forwards as well.
That's really brilliant. I'd love to see them, share more about what they're doing and why they're doing it, because it's such a positive thing for them to be trialing and getting out there into the sector. And the more that can be shared, the better, really. Which is why I was delighted to have found you.
I mean, I guess like as a young trustee, I do have a lot of imposter syndrome of like sitting around a table of people with very senior leadership day jobs. It can be pretty intimidating, but it does mean that I go back and like I'm really thorough with how I read papers and ask questions and do research. I think that part of the value that I bring is my thinking about diversity and equity or something like that. But the reality is, I probably won't feel comfortable feeding into diversity conversations unless I feel heard on other matters as well, which can be totally irrelevant. And I guess, like, when you're thinking about bringing an associate trustee in, you can think about getting them through the door and having them at the table. But really, what matters after that is meaningfully engaging with them once they're part of the group. And that means when they say things, taking that seriously, engaging with their questions. It can make a real difference having another trustee back you up.
Yeah, I do often think the whole structure of board meetings is very kind of old school corporate, bunch of people sitting around a board table and using all this formal jargon, which if you've got a white collar job, it's not strange. You have meetings like that from day one. But if you don't, that's can be incredibly alien. Just words like agenda and chair and minutes and all these words that we just think are completely normal are actually they don't mean anything to a lot of people. And if our sector is going to represent the people we're there to support and everyone in the society, then maybe we shouldn't have a kind of corporate style structure behind it. But that's possibly one for another podcast episode.
I think I'm not against it, but my background is very much I come from cooperatives, non hierarchical organizing. And so we do have like chairs and minutes and things like this. But there is definitely like a working document of vocab that I keep to be able to stay on top of the things that they're saying. And just to come back to the other question that you were talking to me about what could other charities do when they talk about doing this? I think in our case, like they created a bespoke associate trustee program reactively, but you could do that proactively. So that could look like sending trustees to sector training events. So in our case, that's the Association for Charitable Foundations. And there are things like investment seminars and modern grant making. These are all relevant in my sector, but I found it really helpful to go to their training courses. But then I found a lot of my learning has come from going to events and conferences and meeting people outside my organization, which almost helps to contextualize my organization. And just generally, I have 6 weekly one on ones with my chief exec, which is really helpful. I have one on ones with other staff as well. And I do have a buddy on the board who, at least in the earlier days, was more helpful with helping me understand papers and stuff. Now, before each board meeting, I chat to a couple of the other trustees and we just try and gauge how much we understand the papers together, because they can be like, hundreds of pages, maybe 200 pages for each meeting, and there's a lot to get through.
I mean, I work a lot with charity boards and with trustees, and I don't know many trustees who are doing all the things that you've just talked about doing. So, it sounds like you're working your socks off for this, and that must be really of benefit to the organisation to have someone who's that engaged.
It's incredibly fun, and I don't expect to have this opportunity ever again. I think that's probably why I make the most of it, because for quarter after quarter, it's felt like I don't know if I'll get to be back in this room again. I don't know if I'll get to continue doing this. And so if I want to get something out of it, I better do it now. Even today, we're doing like some sort of weird competition with loads of asset managers. And it's like, okay, I'm doing a crash course on asset classes and investment now. Let's learn about this. But it's great. It's a great opportunity.
Oh, that's brilliant. I would love trustees to do that. Trustees should generally take inspiration from this. So it's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Sim, for your time and for coming on the podcast. It's fantastic to have you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Our next guest is a little unusual. Due to her fears of being targeted by the Commission as a paid CEO trustee, she was not willing to appear directly on the podcast. So her personal statement is being read by an actor.
I registered my charity a year ago after realising there was a huge gap in support for people like me. I'd been through treatment for a rare illness that mostly affects older people, and I found that everything available was designed for them. The tone, the information, even the peer support. None of it spoke to my experience. I wanted to change that. What started as a small online group quickly grew into a community. I just wanted to find a few others who understood. Then the floodgates opened. Because of treatment, I had to stop my business, and although my advocacy work began to take off, all the opportunities were unpaid. I kept being invited into meetings, governance groups, best practice panels, but every time I walked into the room, it was full of people who could afford to be there. I was in debt from treatment. All the financial security I'd built had vanished, and that's when it hit me. Everyone wanted me to do this work for free, to speak for my community, to lead change, but without any pay. It was ridiculous. I'd already lost enough, and my community had lost enough. The charities I came across were often led by people untouched by the reality of illness, well-meaning, but far removed. I would hear this saviour language directed at me and others, and it made me angry. The people in leadership and trustee roles nearly always had personal wealth behind them, and that is just wrong. Some organisations even offered to take us in, but I knew that if I joined, I would be told what we could and could not say. We wanted to do things differently, and that meant staying independent. I could not hand over my life's work and have it diluted by people who did not live it. Starting a charity from scratch, I have learnt that the system is stacked against founders who do not have money. It's almost impossible to set something up legitimately unless you can afford not to take a salary or you're willing to sacrifice everything. I fall into that second group. I do not take a full-time salary. I survive. I understand why the rules exist, to stop abuse, but they also stop people like me. The Charity Commission say trustees cannot be paid, but in a new charity, it's usually the founder doing all of the work. If they really wanted new, relevant charities rooted in lived experience, they need to find a way for founders to earn an income in the early phase. Otherwise, they are killing off ideas before they start. My trustees are well-meaning, but they are new to governance, and they do not volunteer beyond attending meetings. The reality is that this charity would not exist without me. There is no one else to lead it. Eventually, when things are stable, I will become an employee and step off the board, but right now we would fold without me. I know other founders who have made that leap, moved from trustee to CEO, only for boards later to decide to shut the charity down. It's a risk. Once you hand it over, you might lose everything you have built. I'm not asking to be an exception. I just want a system that recognises that lived experience leaders need to eat too. If we want diversity in leadership, if we want charities that genuinely reflect the people they serve, then not paying founders and trustees is not just unfair, it is exclusionary.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm founder and chief exec of Kids Club Kampala. I'm a trustee of the Small International Development Charities Network, SIDCAN, and I also sit on the National Small Charities Advisory Panel hosted by NCVO.
Fabulous. Now, I heard a rumour that you caused a bit of a stir at the last Festival of Trusteeship. So what was that all about?
Yes, so at the last Festival of Trusteeship, I took part in a session called Trusteeship Transformed, Bold Ideas from the Front Line. And the session was, there was a number of us, about 10 of us, had 3 minutes each to pitch a radical idea that would transform the future of trusteeship. I chose to spend my 3-minute pitch talking about why I felt trustees should be paid. And out of all the sessions and all the wonderful speakers for the whole week of the Festival of Trusteeship, my 3-minute pitch was the only thing that got a complaint out of the whole festival. So I'm always here to cause a little bit of trouble.
It's just crazy, isn't it? That it's this thing that gets people so het up.
Yeah.
But we've talked before about challenges you faced on your board with recruitment. So can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, so at SIDCN, we recently had a round of recruitment and we received 58 applications, and they were all incredibly strong trustee applications. We were originally going to recruit 3 trustees, but because of the quality, we ended up recruiting 5 trustees, and they're all incredible. However, SIDCAN, we are a consortium organisation of members who are all representative of small charities working internationally. Not one of those 58 incredible applications was from a member or representing a member organisation. So we went back to our members and sort of asked why this was. And a lot of the reason was that people just didn't simply have the time. Many members are volunteers. They may be running a small international charity in their spare time or alongside other things and other commitments. So we are talking to the Charity Commission around looking at, can we get permission to pay trustees to attend meetings? And we're also looking at setting up a members advisory panel that would specifically be represented by members, and that we would be able to provide some sort of financial remuneration for them to sit on that panel.
Yeah, we've just been talking to someone actually earlier in the podcast about the efforts that you can go to create these paid opportunities, but they're still outside the power that trustees hold. And I think it's wonderful that organizations are trying to develop structures to do that. But it is a shame that there's still that barrier to full participation as a trustee on a paid basis for so many. Have you had any kind of response from the Charity Commission as yet?
Not yet. We haven't had a response as of yet. But no, I do agree with that. As I said earlier, I sit on the Small Charities Advisory Panel, which is a great opportunity, but we sit outside of the Board of Trustees of NCVO, and there are decisions that sometimes take place and then we're brought in later, and it does feel sometimes there's disparity, and maybe we should work closer together.
What do you think would be a helpful next step for the sector on this issue?
I think just talking about this more, which is, great that this podcast episode is happening. it seems to be such a taboo subject and very polarising. When I've mentioned it to people, I was trying to get feedback from SIDCAN members around this issue. And even though I was repeatedly saying, I'm not looking to have a debate on this around this conversation, it was very triggering for lots of people. And I think alongside that, it's challenging the idea of what makes a good trustee. Quite a lot of the feedback that I got was saying, well, if we have to pay trustees, then only the large charities with loads of money can afford to have the best people on the board. And I would really challenge, what does it mean by best? Often the best people for your board are the best people who understand the organisation, maybe the people with lived experience who wouldn't have the time to volunteer if they weren't paid for that. So I think it'd be challenging that, but just creating space to have a conversation and keep talking about this and keep challenging people gently about this. I think paying trustees doesn't mean putting someone on payroll. It just means offering. It wouldn't need to be every charity needs to make sure they pay all their trustees, but just having that option available for those that needed it.
Absolutely. There often seems to be a bit of straw manning that goes on around this, that charities can't afford trustees, therefore we shouldn't pay any trustees. Or, as you say, the biggest charities will be able to afford it the most, therefore we shouldn't do it. And I think that's part of the problem around the discussion. It feels like that when we talk about this, it's not meant to solve the lack of diversity in the sector. It's not a complete panacea for everything. But it is one tool that we haven't really had a chance to use as yet. But it seems like it just gets shut down quite a lot through these straw man arguments that I'm personally not convinced are adequate to shut them down in terms of even just, we could have a pilot. We could try 50 different charities doing these things. We know that there's, something like 1.6 or 1.7% of charities do pay their trustees in one way or another. So why are we not looking into those charities and finding out? So yeah, it is really interesting. And I did think it was interesting when I heard about that complaint about yours, of all the things, people were saying some pretty interesting, innovative, challenging things in that festival. But that's the thing that prompted someone to actually take action. And I think it must go to the heart of the power dynamics and where power is held and who we want to hold power. And it's not the people who can't afford to be trustees.
And so many sort of board members of housing associations or NHS trusts are paid. It's often the norm within other countries, particularly in the global south, to pay board members to attend trustee meetings. I don't know why it's such a polarising thing when we suddenly think about it within UK charities. And I do think it's often because people hear it and they just think, oh, well, we haven't got the money, we can't afford to do it. And I think they're coming from that point, because I found the pushback is often from the smaller charities. And I think when people are stressed and constrained with resources, think, oh my goodness, this is another cost that I can't possibly afford. Whereas it's not saying you have to pay your trustees, and it's not saying, it's not saying that. It's just saying consider it as an option if board members are important to you, and if you really want that diversity of thought and diversity of backgrounds and you want lived experience on your board, then just consider it as an option. And I don't know why it is so triggering for so many people, but possibly that's why.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Olivia. I really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tim Harrison-Byrne. I'm one of the two co-managing directors at NFP Research, and NFP Research is a research agency that works solely with non-profits across the UK, Ireland, and a little bit in North America now as well.
So the reason I initially reached out to you is because of some very interesting research that NFP Research did last year. Now, one of the main reasons that is put forward for not paying trustees is the idea that public trust in the sector is based on the voluntary nature of trustees. And this is particularly said most often by the CEO of the Charity Commission. But the research coming out of NFP Research found that only 15% of the public think that trustees are responsible for the actions of individual charities anyway. And more than 40% already thought that trustees were paid. And more than a third thought that the Charity Commission is responsible for charities. So one of the ironies here, of course, is that the board members of the Charity Commission are paid, and we don't hear the CEO of the Charity Commission arguing that public trust would expect them not to be. But side point, I reached out to you to talk about this, and it was one of those conversations that brought unexpected fruit, as you amazingly offered to go out to the public and find out more. So tell me about this latest research that you've been doing and what you found.
So at the end of last year, went out to the public again. So I think the research you referenced was from March 2025, and we wanted to add a little bit more detail onto what we found back then. So I think three most important findings from it, and I think most people will pick something out that they're interested in. But for me, only 13% of the public say that they definitely know what a charity trustee is. So there's about a further 27% who say, I probably know what one is, but only 13% are really confident that they recognize or know what a charity trustee is. And that rises to 18% when we provided them with actually the correct definition of what a trustee is. So awareness and understanding is really low. Likewise, openness to becoming a trustee is very low as well. So only 6% of the public said that they would definitely consider becoming a trustee, and a further 18% say they would probably consider it. So that kind of first key finding is awareness and understanding is not really there on the side of the public. Another important point was kind of on the barriers and drivers to what makes somebody consider or not consider becoming a trustee. And I guess unsurprisingly, on the barrier side, time is a really important one. People say they don't have the time. Skills and experience also up there, and also a worry about being legally responsible. And we kind of often hear that from people that there's a fear of the legal responsibility. But I think if you dig into that time point, which was the top one, 32% of the public said that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't consider it. I think if you were to say, well, this is actually a paid position and you would be remunerated for your time, I think that might disappear, because I think people are under time pressure because work is so all-encompassing and all-consuming for so many people. On the flip side, on the drivers, so training and support is a really big driver, like people seeing it as an opportunity to develop that. Unsurprisingly, that's really important for younger people. But there's a clear correlation with training and support and also being paid for your time. So if you said, okay, you would actually be paid for your time as a trustee, for young people, that's really important. And there's a clear correlation with age here. The older you get, and it pretty much happens with each age cohort, the less likely you are to say that being paid for your time is important to you. So training, support, and being paid for your time, really important for the younger people.
The fact that we've got a sector that is heavily weighted towards older trustees, that feels really, really important, that point.
Definitely. So speaking to that, and the whole point of paying trustees, when we actually put the question to the public, are there any circumstances where paying trustees is justified? Only 16% of the public say there aren't any circumstances where paying them is justified. So actually, there's a whole host of reasons that the public can see that justify paying trustees. So the main one being where you might need specialized professional skills. So 35% of the public recognize that. Where trustees have lost income because of their trusteeship and their responsibilities. And the third kind of top reason, where trustees are doing significant work in between meetings. And how many trustees are not doing that, I wonder, but that's on 25%. So there's like a whole host of reasons that the public can see that justify paying trustees.
That's really interesting feedback from the research. And, I think there's so much that you've just said that there could be a podcast episode in itself. I think this, the public misinformation about trustees is a fundamental problem. We talked about that in our very first podcast episode about the media, but it's also the public. And that level of interest in being a trustee being so low is a massive problem. And I'm seeing a lot of charities really struggle to get people on board. So, I kind of want to acknowledge the wider implications of what you're saying. But obviously, within the context of today's podcast, we're really talking about paying trustees. So I'm kind of going to set it aside for now, but just note that it does feel really fundamental. Was it 6% you said we're definitely interested? That is tiny, and we really need trustees. But for me, I feel like this research and the research done last year, it really does kind of break apart that straw man, I would say, is the argument that public trust in the voluntary sector is a valid reason to deny paying trustees.
I guess that the research really highlights that it doesn't support the argument that public trust is dependent on trustees not being paid. And that's one of the fundamental principles, because people don't really know what trustees are or what trustees do. So, if one of your kind of perceived, or one of the arguments is that a fundamental driver of trust in the sector is that trustees are unpaid, or it doesn't really hold up because actually people don't know about it. I think we've tracked trust in charities for best part of 2 decades and have seen consistently trust in charities has been really quite high. Charities are one of the most trusted institutions in the UK, around about 65%, sometimes up to 75%. One of the biggest changes that we've seen in trust is when trust falls, and that's when scandals hit. And so the biggest fall in trust that we saw was with Kids Company, and that was a decade ago. Kind of the scandal with what happened with Oxfam didn't really have a big impact on trust in the sector. It had a big impact on trust in Oxfam. So those are when we see the biggest changes in trust. We don't see like huge increases. And I think, to argue that trust would fall because trustees were being paid, which some are, which I think you told me, I don't think it really stacks up. It's not to say that charities paying any staff is popular by any stretch. Like, I think only in that research we did in March last year, only 50% of the public think that charity chief execs should be paid.
It's such a fundamental problem, though, isn't it? Because, this idea that staff at all shouldn't be paid, and that just is going to contribute to charities being even less representative than they already are of the population, wider population. It's very difficult to overcome those prejudices.
Yeah, and it's so fraught with misconceptions, and emotion is in there very heavily, and that kind of poor understanding as well. So when we'll often do focus groups on various different topics, and chief exec pay will usually come up as, oh, did you see that so-and-so was earning this? Or can't believe it, I thought they were all volunteers. But then when you ask them about their favorite charity, it's like, oh, this dementia charity or this animal charity is my favorite. Very cool. The chief exec will be earning just as much as the other one that they've just referenced, but it's because it's their favorite charity and no bad can be said of it. So there are some real inconsistencies in how people talk about this topic as well.
And I think this is the thing about this episode. We're not saying that all trustees should be paid. We're not saying that payment is going to solve all the problems as well that we're facing and trying to get trustees on board. So I guess, if we're looking more widely than that, what should the Charity Commission and sector bodies like NCVO, Akivo, DSE, what should they realistically be doing instead?
Where there has been talk in the sector for a long time of improving the understanding of what a modern charity looks like and what the modern charity sector looks like. The sector is so diverse, it's so broad. Charities will work on education, healthcare, animal welfare, and some will be tiny and work on the preservation of the cathedral grounds, and some will be huge and spend millions on medical research. Obviously, their needs are different for each of those organizations, and I think public understanding just has not really changed alongside that kind of change in the charity sector and charity structure. So charity trustees and paying charity trustees and governance is an element of just improving overall understanding of the sector.
And I guess this is one of the things that it feels really hard for us to have that influence. I mean, obviously, I go out one person at a time. Every single time I'm having a conversation with someone about what I do, it comes up about, misunderstandings about the charity sector and whether people are paid and all of that kind of thing. Like, it constantly comes up, and I try patiently to point out the realities, and people seem to be quite open to that, and they'll often be like, I've never looked at it that way. But that's one person at a time, and I think we're all out there facing this misunderstanding, and it's really tricky when we don't have a media that's willing to talk about that type of thing. And yeah, it just feels like it's really hard within the sector to know what to do, I suppose. And I guess that's why I'd probably like to see more leadership from the Charity Commission on promoting what the sector is really like and what our potential is.
I agree. And I think the question would be, like, why doesn't it happen? Because I think, as you say, you've been talking about it a long time. People recognize it as an issue. And ultimately, it probably comes down to money, of who's going to invest in a campaign that speaks to the benefit of the broader sector as opposed to your individual charity. And it seems like the Charity Commission maybe are not well resourced enough to do it, or have prioritised other areas. And it's just important to talk about the risks, I think, of not doing it. And we've been talking about it for a while, but we've been quite lucky, I think, that we've not, as a sector, come under huge scrutiny in the last few years. I think Kids Company was the last one, and it felt like it was ramping up then, and we had the kind of stories around Olive Cook, etc., and who's a fundraiser, and it was all escalating. But then we've had Brexit, we've had the pandemic, we've had a whole host of geopolitical, huge global tensions, but it just means that there's rarely a quiet news day, which I think is what people used to fear a little bit more in the sector. But the danger of it is, with a lack of understanding, it leaves you vulnerable to attack, in short, and to people not understanding you and therefore defending you when the chips are down. And if we look across at what's happening in the States, and I've just written a blog about this, and the US sector has gone very quiet because of fears around the finances, regulation, but also like reputation. And the defense of it has been very weak. And whilst they have high levels of trust with the public, actually, the public have been relatively relaxed about large nonprofits and foundations coming under attack from the administration. So it leaves you vulnerable, is the point. But who is the person who's going to invest in it and invest quite a lot of money in changing public perceptions on it? And that's tough.
Yeah, because of course they've got the Charity Defence League, don't they, in America? I haven't seen them do anything for a while, but they seem to be such a useful voice earlier on, just to be that, like the I'm Overhead t-shirt and the, trying to challenge these ideas about where money's spent and that type of thing. But I haven't heard them in the news for a while, so I don't know how active they still are. Great. Thank you so much for your time, for the research, and for coming on the podcast.
Wow. So I think once again, you haven't disappointed, Felicia. That has been a fascinating discussion. And I think it is good to have it. One point which I do think is clear is that it is a tricky issue for a reason. It's not simple. It's not just about pay. I think it's about the system that charities are working within. And I think definitely if the sector lurched into paying trustees, there could be some very negative consequences. So charities have to be very ready for this if more of them are going to do it. And do this badly, and the whole sector would take a big reputational hit, which is something the charity sector most definitely does not need.
Yeah, and I completely agree. Care is needed, that's for sure. And I don't think it's all or nothing. And I think that's one of the things that's often posited as a rejection. Charities can't afford this. And if it happened to everybody, we could absolutely do a pilot project where paying trustees for inclusion and access is trialled at a few hundred charities to see what the impact would be. Or we could see the Charity Commission doing some research or review about what's happening at those charities who are already paying their trustees, because it feels like they've got all these different things going out there without that consistency. But we could get some learning from that. We could get tighter guidelines and consistency from the Commission on when they say yes and why they say no. I don't think this is necessarily shared by everyone in the sector, but I don't think we should be paying people because we need to attract corporate NED style trustees. I think those are the people who can already afford to participate, or they can be paid as expert committee advisors or the like and not hold ultimate vote. But I do think we should be paying people whose access to that seat at the table requires payment, because the current model privileges people with time, financial security, and frankly, already existing power. And I don't think that's what our sector should be about. But payment is only one lever. It's not a silver bullet.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think all roads are in this discussion are leading back to your mission in life, Felicia, which is to redefine the charity sector as the for impact sector. Because I do agree that, I wouldn't pay the leaders of well-intentioned but amateur and pretty ineffective organisations. But we know that is not an accurate view of the charity sector. It's professional, it's dynamic, it is carrying huge responsibility and influence. I think I would pay the leaders of these kinds of organisations.
Yeah, and I was so struck listening to Simon about how seriously she takes her role. And working in governance, doing a lot of governance reviews, I see a lot of trustees who don't do a quarter of what she's doing. And if you ask any charity CEO about one of their frustrations with trustees, many will cite trustees who turn up not having read the papers. And we always know that when people haven't read the papers, and in some of the badly performing boards I've worked to support in people who've gotten into crisis, you sometimes get that defensive, well, it's just a voluntary role reaction, and that's used to reject training or away days or board development, expectations of additional commitment. It's seen as a legitimate rejection, and perhaps being paid brings in that level of accountability we're missing currently.
Well, I'd suggest that maybe the sector would be more ready to approach the conversation about trustee pay when it has readjusted its reputation a bit in the eyes of the public. And I think the for impact sector would be well within its rights to raise the question of trustee pay.
And I'd turn that the other way around, so that by taking steps to raise the expectations of trustees, to increase diversity and be more inclusive, including, but not limited to, measures such as paying trustees in limited circumstances, we will help readjust the reputation of our sector in the eyes of the public. And I don't think we'll change anything until we make changes to ourselves. But having this disagreement and discussion is exactly what I think we need. We need to thrash out ideas through open debate and discussion in which all voices are heard. We need to try things out and, importantly, test our assumptions against actual evidence, which we can only get if we invest time in pilots and research.
Well, I think this podcast is really doing what it set out to do, unafraid of getting stuck into the sticky issues. So, gosh, here's to our next episode.
As always, thanks so much to our guests today and to the Benefat Group for supporting this podcast.